Hello, everyone. I'm going to start the webinar now. You're very, very welcome indeed. This is, I think, number 15 or so of our Oxford World's Classics, Oxford English Faculty Shakespeare webinars. And I'm delighted that you're here. It's always lovely to see coming into the webinar space some familiar names, but also some people who I think maybe have not been before. So welcome back if you're coming back. Welcome if you're here for the first time. The format of these events is always pretty much the same. I talk with my guest, who is the person who wrote the introduction to the particular play that we're talking about today, Arden of Faversham, and Iman Sheeha, and I we have a conversation together, and then there's a bit of space for Q&A at the end. So I encourage you to use the Q&A to raise any questions that you have. If you raise them earlier, it's perhaps more likely that we will get to them. But if you want to put them in at the last minute, that's also fine. Before I ask Iman to get a word in edgeways, there's just a few little bits of sort of housekeeping. Firstly, to remind you that this is work that we have done in the World's Classics part, which is the sort of diffusion line of a very, very high-end academic project, the New Oxford Shakespeare, that exists in numerous academic volumes, including a forthcoming one of alternate versions. And it's under the editorial leadership of Gary Taylor, John Jowett, Terry Boris, and Gabriel Egan. And lots of the questions, the big questions about how the text is the way it is, the technical questions about editorial practice, we tend to refer highly interested readers, which we hope you are, back to that big text. That's not what we're doing. Really, our job has been to think about how these plays might live with a readership, perhaps a theatre-going readership, perhaps people who are studying, but maybe people who are reading for pleasure, how this might work in the 21st century. And they're the kinds of introductions that we've tried to do. And so on that, we're going to talk really briefly before we get properly going about the authorship of this play, and then we'll come back to that. But really, our seminar this evening is not about who wrote Arden of Faversham. In fact, it's more about why you should care, because it's such a fantastic play. And I knew when I was looking around, if you've been before, one of my great treats in supervising this project has been to pick the people I knew would be great at different things. And I knew Iman would be the person to talk about this play because of work she had done on maids, on the beautiful article called the quoting Desdemona, a maid called Barbary, and other work on the sort of domestic space and on drama. And that's what we're going to really get her expertise on this evening. So, Iman, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. Delighted to be here.
It's really great to have you. When I asked you to do this, did you have any qualms about it? I mean, what did this feel like? This is right inside your kind of bailiwick.
Yeah, that's a really great opening question. I mean, obviously, I'm obsessed with Arden. I've been working on Arden for decades. I wrote my master's dissertation on Arden and then wrote a chapter on it for my book on domestic servants, which you mentioned, Emma. So I was so excited to just really sink my teeth into this project and write this introduction for people who might not know much about this play, might not have heard of this play. But at the same time, there was this worry, I think, at the back of my mind about the kind of, and you sort of referenced this in your opening as well. There's sometimes some sort of resistance to seeing this play connected with the name Shakespeare. There's sometimes a preconceived idea of what a Shakespeare looks like, what a play what kind of genre, what kind of characters even we expect to see. So I wanted to take the plunge, and I hope it worked.
It absolutely does work. So, I mean, when we just were talking about how we would run this, I said I would say a little bit, just right at the beginning about the authorship of this play, and then we'll talk about, as I say, why the play matters and why it's interesting, and maybe we'll come back to those questions of authorship. If you've been to these webinars before, that there has been a lot of recent work, and the New Oxford Shakespeare is part of the engine of that work really on Shakespeare and authorship, particularly on collaborative authorship. And I think when we talk about Arden, we're talking about another early collaborative play, like the Henry VI plays that we have already had the chance to discuss over the last couple of webinars. So we're thinking about an early Shakespeare who is part of I think what Kavita Mudan Finn talked about on the in her Henry VI webinar about a kind of writer's room, a place where there's a practical need for plays to come out quite quickly, and perhaps there's a way that playwrights are developing their individual craft and their collective work by working together. And Arden has fallen into that same category, largely due to the kinds of dispassionate might be one way to see it, dispassionate analysis that computer approaches can do. Looking not so much, we talked about this last time too, not so much at things that are utterly distinctive, but at little tiny quirks or habits of speech that sometimes indicate one writer rather than another. We should say about Arden of Faversham, there's another big sort of big dog vying to be the author here, and that's Thomas Kidd.
Mhm.
Kidd has got a lot of interesting academic support. So there's a big sort of Team Shakespeare versus Team Kidd, and that can sometimes be a bit gladiatorial, I think, for both of us, which was exactly the thing that we didn't particularly want to get involved with. So let's leave it there for the authorship now, but we'll come back to that. But I wanted to ask Iman to start. Let's assume that many people on this call are quite surprised to have this in a complete Shakespeare, and they need to start from the beginning. When, what, you know, Arden, as it were, what 101.
Yeah, where it sits, yes. So Arden is very much an early play when it comes to Shakespeare's career. When we think about collaborative authorship, again, like you said, Emma, we are thinking about, in relation to this play, potentially two playwrights working together, one more senior than the other. I really like to think about Shakespeare in this play as a senior, if you like, apprentice. He seems to be getting there. It's a graduation project almost, and it's mainly the central part from which I've chosen a passage to share with everyone today that gets allocated to Shakespeare in the authorship attribution studies. So if Shakespeare had a hand in this play, this was pretty early in his career. So the play, we think, was written in the late 80s. It's very much based on a work of history, Raphael Holinshed's Chronicle, which which includes an account of the Strew murder in 1551, so a good 40 years before the play gets performed and then published in 1592. And the murder concerns this figure in Kent, in Faversham, Thomas Arden, who was killed by his wife and has so many co-conspirators. The murder captured the imagination of the nation. Tellingly, it ended up in this book of history, like I said, and the playwright follows this narrative pretty closely. So the plot goes as follows. Arden opens the play, sharing his misery with his friend, confiding in his friend Franklin that his wife is unfaithful, that she has taken a lover, that he even says a really curious thing. He says that he's seen a wedding band on her finger that he believes must be there's some form of marriage that they've gone through. It's not pretty clear what happens, but it's there. But this revelation coincides as well with another piece of information, the fact that Arden has just been granted lands, the Abbey lands. So this connects the play with, places the play right at the center of a really important historical event, the dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VIII, beginning in the 30s, 1530s, when land started to shift away from being the sign of the aristocracy, a status marker, to being a commodity that people like Arden could perhaps buy and move up in the world. So
That's amazing. I'm just going to come in there because I think that's such an important point
it's
that in the
important.
opening scene of the play, that Arden has got this abbey land from the dissolution of the monasteries and that his wife are being unfaithful. We don't know how they're connected, but they sort of are connected. And I just thought, I mean, the social history around this play is one of the ways that you and other scholars have made it so alive. Um, it's just worth just resting for a minute on how transformative that moment was. I mean, this was land which had never been for sale, had it? They'd
Yes,
never, all through the sort of 15th into the 16th century, even if you had money and didn't have land, you couldn't buy land because
yeah,
why would anybody sell it? So this is an absolute upheaval, isn't it,
absolutely,
social
absolutely.
status and social class. Yeah.
Yeah, and in many ways, the play is a study of the impact of that on the small community, because a
Mm.
result of that distribution of land, a result of that land changing hands and suddenly becoming the possession of one person, as opposed to the monastery, to the abbey, is that previous tenants, people who could make use of this land, became dispossessed. So in the play, we have, even though the title page, the title of the play is very much about Arden as a tragic figure, and his wife is this wicked and lustful woman who wanted him out of the way. The play itself is more complicated than that, in the sense that we see those previous tenants challenging Arden. One of them, Green, agrees to murder him in exchange for his land, says Alice Arden, returning to his position. So this huge event, in characteristic of domestic tragedy, is very much treated on a smaller domestic scale. So often when we think about the Reformation, we're thinking Thomas Cromwell, and if anyone has seen Wolf Hall and intrigues at court. But this event had real effects on people's lives further down the scale, people like Reed and Green in
Yeah, that's so interesting. So that phrase domestic tragedy,
Mm.
it feels almost paradoxical in some ways. We think that whatever tragedy is, it's high flown, it's significant, it's the opposite of domestic. Tell us about the use of that phrase and that particular Elizabethan genre.
Yeah, so obviously there's a caveat here that domestic tragedy, the label, wasn't applied to these plays when they were being written and
Mm,
performed. So this is a label that we kind of stick on these plays later on,
mm.
starting with the 19th century onwards. But in the time when these plays were written, tragedy was very much a genre that concerned itself with the high and mighty, like you said, Emma, with kings and queens and conquerors and heroes. Um, the everyday lives, the everyday struggles of people like the Ardens and their servants and their neighbors and their community weren't exactly didn't belong in that kind of conception of tragedy. So what these tragedies were doing, starting with Arden, and again, just to emphasize that Arden is only the first surviving example, there might be others before it, because a 40-year period between his murder in the early 1550s and then its publication in the early 1590s is a very long time. And I think there might have been others, but they haven't survived. A domestic tragedy was very much a kind of an oxymoron, a contradiction in terms. How could the domestic be tragic? How could the domestic be given this tragic stature, if you like, which has always been the preserve of the royal figures? So Arden was really a quiet revolution in its own way. And I think today it's hard to appreciate what a revolution, a quiet revolution it was, because today we're used to seeing thrillers about everyday struggles. We're used to, those of you who are fans of true crime or docudrama, we're used to see kitchen sink drama. But in this period, figures like Arden, especially figures like Arden who are dealing with cuckoldry, with marital problems, they belonged in comedy. They were comic figures. They weren't tragic figures. So what the play does, and others like it that follows it in that time period, the late 16th century to the mid 17th, was pretty revolutionary in this time.
Yeah, that's absolutely great. And you said when you were talking about it a minute ago, you said that the tragedy of Arden and the community in Faversham sort of reproduces in miniature form these larger social
Mhm.
factors. And I was thinking about that seems to me to be one of the most fascinating things about this term domestic tragedy, um, that the domestic uh, it is a sort of way of well, yes, domesticating big scale questions. And you write really interestingly in your introduction about the extent, the sort of analogies between the king in his kingdom, the master in his household, the
Mhm.
husband in his marriage. These
Mhm.
are all at different scales, hierarchical, ordered positions that are sort of mirror images of each other. And tell us
Absolutely.
about petty treason, which I think is
Yes.
an extraordinary term.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, today I think we're more used to thinking about our households, our families as private spheres. In this period, households, families were very much political and very much public. Disorder in the home had consequences for society at large. And that's captured by the idea of, by the legal category of petty treason. I imagine high treason would be more familiar to people today. High treason is obviously treason against a reigning monarch. Petty treason is its domestic equivalent, again made smaller, but it doesn't mean that it's smaller in its consequences. So petty treason in this period was a class crime as well as a gender crime. So a wife who murdered her husband was a petty traitor, as is the case with Alice Arden, and she received punishment which was different to any kind of murder. So a husband who murdered his wife was treated as a murderer. He was hanged. But a wife who murdered her husband would have received the same punishment as a woman who went and murdered her king, right? Because analogically speaking, the husband was her king. So Alice Arden and other women convicted of murdering their husbands were burnt at the stake. The same applies to servants who murdered their masters or mistresses. And it's really interesting there the way that class and gender, I think, seem to kind of be in conflict with each other because the mistress of the household is in a position of social authority over her servants. So were she to be murdered by a male servant, would that count as petty treason on his part? We don't know how that dynamic worked out. But we know that Michael, the historical Michael behind the figure in the play, was punished for petty treason, as was the maidservant, who is Susan in the play.
Yeah, that's really fascinating, isn't it? So that um, I was really struck when you said right at the beginning that you thought about Shakespeare as being a senior sort of apprentice here, and that suddenly was a light bulb moment of thinking that this is a play which is all about forms of service and
Yes,
servants and
yes.
servants who get above themselves and so on. Excuse me, it's interesting to take that to the writing itself. Yeah, so Michael and Susan, the two servants in the Ardens household. You, you've explained actually why they're so implicated willy-nilly. They can't do anything about it in the lives of their master and mistress. There is no privacy. So can you talk a bit more about privacy and where that's found? I was thinking about Arden in his counting house, for instance.
Yes. Yes, which he seems to think in the play is his own private space. And then ironically, his very would-be murderers are ensconced in this space. There's this bizarre murder plot where they create this image of this picture of Alice. And she says, oh, okay. And apparently, if he looks at it, it would poison him and kill him right there. And then she says, oh, but then he would see it in the counting house and bring it out to me, and I might look at it and I might die. Um, so she seems to understand his space, that counting house as his own space, but it doesn't end up being like that in the play. But yes, the early modern home wasn't a space of privacy at all. Social historians, historians interested in the architecture of the early modern house, noticed the way that servants, for example, beds were often found in the same bedrooms as their masters and mistresses. We know that children sometimes also shared their sleeping arrangements with servants, which often resulted in sexual abuse. We see in church court records. Servants were everywhere in the early modern home. So today we've pretty much ordinary people, we've replaced servants with technology, right? Today, the work that would have been done by a servant fetching water or lighting a candle, we now have our washing machines, we have our electricity. So servants were very much surrounding those people to carry out these tasks, to do that. In the absence of a postal service, for example, your servant would go and deliver your letter, would go and buy what you need for whether it's firewood or water or whatever it is that's needed for the home. So there was also this mobility of the servants between in and out of the house, which was also dangerous because they could carry out gossip. They could servants like Michael and Susan. Susan never really leaves the home, but Michael is always ready with information about the whereabouts of his master, even his sleeping arrangements when they somehow end up in London and he's recruited to help the hired assassins, the hitmen that Alice hires. Again, he's always ready with information, and that's what made servants dangerous. In the words of a critic whose work I admire, Frances Dolan, talks about the dangerous familiars. So the servants being familiars, being known, being everywhere, but also they're dangerous exactly because of that.
Yeah, that's so great. I mean, I was thinking about the counting house as, I mean, it's so perfect that it is the space where the murderers hide. As you say, Arden thinks of it as a sort of early modern kind of man cave, doesn't he, or den or something, and have man toys in there. But it's also so associated with, obviously, with money, with accounting. Um, and the extent as you bring out, so we've got this plot where Alice has a lover, Mosby. She wants Arden out of the way. She can't get divorced, so she wants to murder him. She brings in all these accomplices, some of whom have their own grudges against Arden because of this land business, some of whom are just thugs for hire, aren't they? And we go through this plot where we're sort of trying to murder Arden, but not quite. And then at the end, perhaps how do you feel the pace of that play works? I mean, I know we know the story already, or the true crime makes it inevitable. I still feel it's quite shocking in a way that
I
Arden is
think,
murdered
yeah,
at the end because
I think
he's
the
he's got away
murderers,
with it, hasn't he? Not got away
yes,
with it. That's the wrong way to see it. But whenever the assassins are there, suddenly, a window falls down on their head and
or they
they're
fall in a
thwarted.
ditch,
They
or
fall in a ditch. There's a lot of sort of black comedy, isn't there here?
yes,
Dark comedy.
yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the murderers themselves are shocked when it happens.
Yeah.
Twice Mosby, Alice's lover, says, let's just give it up. They'll never do it.
Mm.
And then one of them wavers and the other one goes, oh no, let's try again. Let's try
Yeah.
again. And I think I counted there are 9 attempts at his life, of which he's completely oblivious. He has no clue. And I
Yeah.
think it's quite telling as well that the successful murder takes place in his home. And
Mm.
again, thinking about that irony, but also about the domestic as this space. I mean, this is the ultimate betrayal, isn't it? For him to be murdered in the space where he should have been safest, with the
Yeah.
people known to him, with the space over which he's king. So the play really seems to be having it both ways. It's not really sure what it makes of Arden. So on the one hand, he is this tragic figure, right, who is murdered by his wife. He loves her. I think if Arden has one redeeming quality for me is that he loves this woman. He's
Mm.
so blinded. She convinces him again and again to reconcile with Mosby. She literally convinces him that she loves him when all evidence suggests otherwise, right? I mean, this man has his friend Franklin live his life carrying antidotes in his pocket just in case I mean, who does that? Just in case he's poisoned.
Yes.
And it comes in handy. So he's expecting it. You know, she serves him poisoned breakfast broth.
Mm.
And it's very handy that Franklin has an antidote and he takes it immediately. So the murderers themselves are shocked, I would say, when finally it happens. But then Arden himself, he's very hard to like. Put it this way. I mean, the play itself, in the epilogue, having gone through all the several punishments and all of that, we then learn that Arden snatched that land from Green with violence and force. So, what is the murder? Basically divine punishment for his greed and for his lack of interest in other people's right to live their
Mm.
life, make a livelihood, or is it this work of a lustful and dangerous wicked wife?
Mm. Yes, you do that really beautifully in the introduction, saying, on the one hand, the title page, which is pure sort of Daily Mail in a way, isn't it?
Yes,
It's, here is a very terrible, lustful, did we mention lustful, bad woman? Did we say she was lustful? And here you will see her be punished. So you can sort of enjoy the transgression because you know it's going to be punished. But then, as you say, from the beginning onwards, there's this counter to Arden as the victim, um, where Arden is behaving in this deeply acquisitive way. He's privatized that land, hasn't he? It's not just that it's transferred from one ownership to the other, but it's transferred from something more like not collective ownership, but something where there's a bit more inclusion of other
I think it's
people, these
private.
tenants and
Yeah,
so on. And
yes,
he's privatized it for his
yes.
own for his own pleasure. And it's they put his body behind the abbey again, don't they? That we keep being sort of told this is part of the story,
Yeah, a bit
even though it's an
heavy-handed,
unnecessary
right?
plot. A
No,
little bit heavy, a little bit heavy-handed.
yes, and then there's that snow that suddenly starts
Yes.
falling, and so their footprints get detected in the snow, and his body leaves a bloody mark on the ground where he was left forever and ever. So all of these details take away really from his tragic, sympathetic, if you want, yeah, stature.
Yeah. You've got a lovely thing on the sort of the way that crime a
Mm.
sort of true crime works. I think I might have seen Lisa Hopkins in our webinar, which would be great because you're working with ideas of hers, aren't you, about sort of crime fiction. And there's a lovely point where you talk about the way the audience is in forensic evidence is gathered. You've got some lovely stuff about how in the source the mayor of Faversham does all the sort of this is
Yes.
what's happened, this is what the crime has been,
The
and
piecing
in the
together.
play, yeah, and in the play, it's much more,
The
the,
community.
the community discover these things. Yeah. So can you talk a bit more about that sense, perhaps of the community and of the audience as participants in this, um, the sort of revelation of justice in the play?
Yeah. Um, I mean, the experience of play going then and now is very much obviously a collective experience. You're experiencing the same thing on the stage, even though the audience isn't a collective, a homogenous, if you want, collective as such.
Mm,
I mean, I've been to performances where someone suddenly laughs at something incredibly tragic, and I can't help but give them a look.
mm,
But it is a collective experience, and the seeing disorder in the house inside a private family in this way um, obviously invites audience assessment, judgment, especially we're talking about culture. If we travel back to Shakespeare's England, where this was expected that people would keep an eye on each other, the self-regulating, if you want, monitoring community or the moral community, as scholars refer to the early modern community, was very much the norm in this period. Privacy was actually suspicious, to go back to your question about privacy. To lock your door or to shut your window was it in
yeah. What have you
itself
got to hide? What are you
suspicious?
hiding?
What do you
Yeah.
have to hide? If you didn't have
Mm,
anything to hide, why not just leave your door open? Um, yes, this obviously comes as well at a time when the household was becoming more and more important for that sense of social regulation and social control. Again, we're talking about the effect of the dissolution of the monasteries, the breakaway with the Catholic Church, with Rome. So England, as a result, no longer has that central church that was in charge in a way. So the household gets to replace that role, and the household becomes the center of emotional life,
mm,
spiritual life, but also political and social training.
mm,
So part of the reason that people send their children to work as servants in other people's homes was obviously for them to train and to earn some money and save. But there was also a sense that they needed that control. They needed that training, especially when young people were kind of seen with suspicion that they have desires and they have behaviors that need controlling.
mm.
So
Yeah.
neighbors were supposed to keep an eye on the workings of other people's homes. And we see that a lot in court records in this period. When something goes wrong, obviously for a case to go to court, something has to go wrong.
Mm,
So in these dysfunctional households we meet in church court cases, often what happens is neighbors report on what they've seen, what they've heard. They noticed something unusual happening or heard a noise or saw someone enter a house they're not supposed to be in. And that's replicated in the playhouse when
mm,
they have this family on the stage, this domestic space opened up to them, and they're invited to assess and to make that judgment. And then the on-stage characters become, if you want, mirrors for them. They're carrying out tasks that neighbors and the community at large would have been trusted to do. So other domestic tragedies. Arden is a bit isolated as a household. We don't really get much of a sense of community until the very end, where they go collecting evidence and kind of invading the house. But other plays, other domestic tragedies, the two lamentable tragedies, for example, which again, murder of someone's neighbor. It's the neighbors who go knocking on doors. They go looking around for evidence. I think following Penelope Ging's work on true crime in this period, and of course now as well, I think the theatre is doing so much to give credit to lay people, to the community themselves, right? I mean, today in true crime podcasts, which I am a fan of, you get statements from detectives being really fed up with the public, coming up with theories and speculating
Mm.
and suggesting leads and stuff. I think something similar was happening as well in Shakespeare's time, where people just wanted to help, or they were probably curious, and they were pushed away. And then you have the theatre legitimizing that kind of interest and saying that, well, look, the community can solve a murder.
Yeah. So the household, or the sort of extended household, is the source of the murder and the source of the sort of social retribution
Hmm.
for it. Yeah, that's very striking indeed. I love the domestic details that we get. I mean, we talked about the counting house, and you talked about the poisoned broth. It feels very sort of crazily inventive, doesn't it? That and I wanted to ask you about humor. I suppose that's where I'm getting to. In a way, the picture that gives out poisonous beams, the
Yes.
portrait of Alice, which gives out poisonous beams, I mean, is both, so symbolic that, we don't really need to even go there. But it's
It's
also
toxic
so comic, isn't it? I mean, the painter, they say to the painter, how do you paint it without
and stuffs
getting
rhubarb in
he
in
says,
his
I've got, yeah, rhubarb
nose.
under my nose
Yeah.
and my glasses are very
Yes.
tight.
Yes.
You just think this is quite bizarre. Um, do you think, I mean, we've talked about tragedy and the shape of a domestic tragedy. Do you find this play funny? Do you feel there are elements of humor maybe for us now, maybe there always were? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, humor is a weird thing,
Yeah.
in the sense that it doesn't necessarily travel over time. It doesn't, I mean, in this play, you've got lots of misogynistic humor,
Yeah.
especially between the two hitmen, Blackwell
Mm,
and Shakeback. So much misogyny, so much sexism going on.
mm,
But I think it is meant to be funny. I think if you think about these failed attempts on his life. They're ridiculous. Like,
mm,
what are the
mm.
chances that while Blackwell is about to stab him, this apprentice decides in this very moment to lower his window
Yeah.
on his
Yeah.
head, right?
Yeah.
Or a fog suddenly appears and they fall in a ditch and then he comes up.
Yes.
I mean, you can imagine how funny that would have been
There's a
when
sort of
he,
silent film comedy
uh,
element to that,
yes,
isn't it? A sort of slapstick element. I was thinking, I always think of this as a play I would love to see done by the Coen brothers or something, something with an absurdist sense that can shift to being very threatening, but has some other sort of tone kind of going on.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, in performance, it's very common for people I mean, it's funny. So many failed attempts, so many bizarre situations. There's this
Mm,
crucifix that the painter before the picture, very again incredibly bizarre. He produces this poisonous crucifix as well, and he says, we'll do this, and they
mm,
go, no, this is not going to work. Let's talk about it later, and we never hear
mm,
about it again. Um, yeah, their plots are weird.
mm. Mm. And lots of bits and pieces of stuff. I mean, you talked about the band, the wedding band. There's the pair of dice, aren't there? The prayer book that I think we're going to look at in a minute.
Yeah, with the
There's
golden covers. Yeah.
yeah, there's quite a lot of. I mean, there's quite a lot of stuff in this play. Is that too a reflection of how a sort of lower bourgeois household like the Ardens is changing? I think I've read that stuff saying. Um, will inventories of possessions
Yes.
show a huge increase in the possessions that quite average people own over perhaps the second half of the 16th century or
Yeah,
something.
absolutely. Yeah. Increase in commodities, increase in, I mean, the houses themselves for people who could afford them were getting bigger. and more specialized rooms were being added as well and expected by the late of the 16th century. So while earlier you get the hall, which is the center of the home, and the hearth, the heart of the home, right?
Mm.
Where the family would have had their meals. Um, Towards the end of the 16th century, you start getting the parlor. You start getting more specialized rooms where the family withdrew for a little bit more privacy and servants ate separately. And yes, commodities start, the acquisition is just crazy in this period. The scholar to read on this is Catherine Richardson. She's done so much on inventories and how they products and commodities that we see in the inventories appear again and resurface in these plays. And just on your point, Emma, about the kind of the status of those people, obviously when we say tragedies about kings and queens, this is not about them, but we're not talking about poor people either. We're not
Mm.
talking about people who, I mean, the Ardens are pretty influential locally. The historical Thomas Arden was the mayor of Faversham for a while. This person was pretty influential. They employ servants. They have lands. He travels on business journeys. So they're not poor either. They're middling, so in
Yeah.
the middle, kind of middle class. But
Yeah.
yes, they own silver dice and prayer books with golden covers, and they're
I
well
find the
off.
social status a little bit difficult to pin down, actually. I mean, it's partly because people insult each other by impugning social status, isn't it? So there's a fair bit about Mosby, Alice's lover, who has been a bodger, um, somebody patching old clothes, which is interesting. And then he has sort of obviously improved himself to become a steward in a
Steward, yeah,
household. Yeah.
yes,
But they're all also talking about whether Arden is a real gentleman's, whether it's Alice who has
yes,
married well or married beneath
my
her, or there seems to be
down,
quite a lot
yeah.
of uncertainty about that just in my rereading this weekend.
Yeah, there is. Yes, absolutely. I mean, the historical Arden was definitely socially inferior to Alice. She's the stepdaughter of Lord North, so
Mm,
she has
mm,
an aristocratic background. In the play, it's really very fluid how people refer to each other as master or mistress. Um, when Alice reports back to Mosby on her latest recruit, Green, she tells him, I just met with Master Green. Oh, Green, I mean. She removes his title because she knows that it's a sensitive topic for Mosby.
right.
Um, at one point, Michael addresses the two murderers as gentlemen. So again, there isn't really a solid sense of status as such, but I think that's only to be expected in a period where so much social change was happening. People like Arden were moving up in the world. I mean, again, going back to church court records and where we see people taking each other to court following a dispute over where they would sit in church, because church, obviously, seating in this period was very much meant to reflect the world outside. So gentry would sit in the front pews, and then the lower classes would sit behind. And then what happens, especially in the case of women whose status changed when they married above or below them, where do they sit? And if your neighbor doesn't agree that you're now entitled to sit here, people took each other to court. So much was changing. This is a period of change, of social mobility.
Yeah.
So I think it's only to be expected
Mm.
that we see this in the play.
I want to bring you to the passages you chose for us, but
Yeah.
first, I just want to ask about Alice herself, because I don't feel we've quite captured her sort of transgressive, eloquence. Um, I mean, she's that. I was thinking about that amazing line, "Love is a god and marriage is but words."
Words.
Yeah, love is a god and marriage is but words. I mean, that's kind of an extraordinary thing for a female character to say, I think. Or
Yeah.
it feels like a thing a character in a Christopher Marlowe play might say, or something. T Tell us a bit about. I know earlier criticism of this play was very preoccupied with Alice as the central figure, and we've moved away a bit from a more towards this more sort of social and communitarian vision of what happens and how people fit into that ecosystem. But maybe if we were just to think about her for a moment, what how would you describe her?
Yeah, I mean, she's fascinating. She's a performer, right? She's very much a player. Um, I mean, she's one of the biggest roles assigned to a female character in the drama. She has the most lines, twice more than Arden has. She speaks the most. She has soliloquies. And she's a force of nature, isn't she? The way that she recruits people, she comes up with stories. She manipulates and she falls back on stereotypes of appropriate feminine behavior when it suits her. So there's this one. I think there's no grounds for her accusations. The play doesn't support her in that, but she complains to Green that her husband is cruel to her, that he goes to London to see women, that she's a neglected wife, and he comes to her rescue, right?
Mm.
So she's really good at constructing these narratives around herself and using them to her advantage. When it suits her to be a damsel in distress, she would do it, right? In terms of the love is a god, and I find it so heartbreaking. I don't know how you feel about that, Emma, that at the end of this is not a Romeo and Juliet story. There's no real love here. Definitely not from Mosby. Mosby, in his soliloquy, which we are going to look at closely, he does share his plans. He confides in the audience that, well, she's murdered one husband. Can I trust her not to murder me next when I become her husband? She's a husband murderer, right? He plans to murder her once he's sitting in Arden's seat. So it's so tragic, I think, that she's prepared to take all those risks, thinking that they're both in it together, and Mosby isn't really on the same page,
Mm.
I don't think.
Let's have a look. Speaking of pages, let's have a look at this second scene that you picked that you just referred to.
Yeah, yes.
Just talk us through why you chose this or what you wanted us to notice here.
Sure, yeah. So this comes from scene 8, which the New Oxford Shakespeare editors have concluded shows signs of Shakespeare's authorship. It's usually referred to as the lovers' quarrel scene, and quarrel they do. So what happens is Mosby enters on his own and opens with a soliloquy in which he is reflecting on his situation. He's not getting anywhere with murdering Arden, moving up in the world. He reveals that he was trying to climb this tree, a very subtle metaphor for the social ladder. And if he falls, it's going to be incredibly damaging to him. And then he shares his plans that were he ever to succeed and to become master, instead of Thomas Arden, he will make sure to eliminate all co-conspirators, resonating with Macbeth here. For those of you familiar with Macbeth, I'm eliminating everyone who has ever witnessed or seen me do the deed. And he says, I'll kill her too, because he says it is fearful sleeping in a serpent's bed. And suddenly Alice enters with a prayer book, right? And she says that she's done. She regrets doing what she's done. She wants to go back to being Arden's honest wife. Um, and she has her prayer book as evidence of her repentance. Mosby isn't happy about that. But he retaliates. He says, and I'll just look at a few lines from here. If thou ban, let me breathe curses forth. And if you stand so nicely at your fame, let me repent the credit that I have lost. Again, I've chosen these particular lines because they're so interesting in capturing Mosby's ambition. He's using credit in both its modern term, today when we think about credit cards, that's a financial term, right? But also credit as in reputation. And of course, it was no coincidence in this period because people's reputations were very much tied up with their financial status. Remember, this is a society which is still pretty reliant on oral transactions, and you really needed to be a person who could keep their word to have that credit for people to trust you and lend you money or come and work with you. So I repent that I've lost credit in both senses of the word. That would have stated me above thy state, force-load advantages and spurned at time. Fortune's right hand must be hath forsook. And then he regrets that he has missed out on marrying a maid who is far more beautiful than Alice and far more wealthy than her. So I chose this particular passage because again it really shows how conflicted their relationship is and how quickly they fall into the if you want mutual distrust of each other and how much their actual real motives come to the surface so quickly, the ambition, the social status, the credit, all of these things. And then Alice, moving on to her reply to him, now I see and too soon find it true, which often hath been told me by my friends, that Mosby loves me not but for my wealth, which too incredulous I never believed. Nay, hear me speak, Mosby, a word or two. I'll bite my tongue if I speak bitterly. Look on me, Mosby, or I'll kill myself. Nothing shall hide me from thy stormy look. If thou cry war, there's no peace for me. I will do penance for offending thee. And then she proceeds to offer to burn the prayer book. And of course, going back to love is God and the poisoned crucifix and all of these perverted images of religion, right? This is no surprise that she would be burning her book or offering to tear out the pages and to use Mosby's letters instead as her holy script. So the scene ends with them reconciling again. And I think it visually captures the kind of this narrative move when they enter separately. So like I said, Mosby enters on his own, shares his soliloquy, he's suspicious, he's done with her. Alice enters separately as well, and then they kiss at the end and they leave together. And this is immediately followed by the next attempt on Arden's life. So their kind of energy is renewed at the end of this.
And it's a great example of her playing these different parts. I mean, it will be really hard. I don't mean this in a moral way. I mean this in a sort of theatrical way, actually, really. It would be really hard to pick through which of those is what Alice really thinks. I mean, if that's
Yes,
even a good question. She can
yes,
just flip from
yes.
one mode to the other. Yeah, I was
Yeah.
thinking as we looked at that, I mean, coming in with the prayer book as a sign of your penitence, that's such a thing from Richard III, isn't it?
Yes.
And I wondered if we might
Prop.
finish our bit as a prop,
Mm,
yeah, a kind of religious,
mm.
hypocritical prop. Um, should we finish our bit just by if we do, as the New Oxford Shakespeare has done, bring Arden of Faversham into the Shakespeare canon, are there other plays by Shakespeare that look different or that chime with it in some different ways?
Yeah, yeah. Absolutely. I think you can see resonances, you can see echoes, you can see even thematic echoes, you can see parallels throughout his career. So I sat down this morning just thinking about, okay, so if we approach Shakespeare's canon, accepting that he had a hand in this play, at least in this middle section, what would that mean, for example, for the Merry Wives of Windsor, where we have a Mistress Quickly who goes to Falstaff trying to convince him that Mistress Ford is a damsel in distress because her husband is unfaithful, because her husband is cruel to her. She's suffering, she's struggling, and so she's ready to fall for his charms, right? What does it mean for, I've mentioned Macbeth already, but I am really struck by how similar the scene in Arden following the murder, where she's frantically, and more so Mosby, are trying to keep things together. So Arden has invited his neighbors to come for dinner. And alas, by the time they arrive, he's dead. So obviously they don't want Mosby and the rest of the conspirators, they don't want the neighbors to suspect anything, and they struggle really hard to keep things under wraps. She takes charge. She tells them to sit in their seats. She positions them around the table. And I think it's so fascinating to see the parallel with Macbeth, where again, that murder, you know, with the appearance of Banquo and the ghost that Macbeth sees, and how Lady Macbeth tries to keep things again together, right? And she takes
Mm.
charge when her husband is so distracted. You can even think about Hamlet. Hamlet actually has verbal echoes with another domestic tragedy, which was within the Chamberlain's men's repertoire. So, A Warning for Fair Women, another true crime drama, was performed by Shakespeare's company, the Chamberlain's Men, in 1599. And at that time, Shakespeare was working on Hamlet, right? And this play and Hamlet share the same exact anecdote of a woman. Of course, it has to be a woman because all women are just murderers waiting to be discovered. She goes to the theater to see a play which is a domestic tragedy, which involves a woman murdering her husband. And this woman in the audience suddenly stands up and reveals the fact that I've murdered my husband in exactly the same way. So that conscience, right, awakening as a result of witnessing a theatrical representation is something that A Warning for Fair Women discusses. Two characters discuss that murder will out, right? So there's no hiding murder. And they mention this case. And then in
Mm.
Hamlet, obviously Hamlet thinking about staging the mousetrap to capture the conscience of the king. He also refers to that case of someone again going to the stage and the theater and witnessing murder, and that's how he hopes to expose his uncle as the murderer. So I think parallels are endless, and if someone is interested in that, I would suggest Emma Whipday's book, Shakespeare's Domestic Tragedies, in which she really looks at Shakespeare's canon in relation to domestic tragedies. And her argument, which I completely embrace, is that Shakespeare wasn't working in isolation from these plays. He was definitely interested. I mean, The Merry Wives of Windsor, just to go back to my first example, you have Falstaff telling Mistress Ford, one of the women he's hoping to seduce, I wish thy husband were dead. Right? I mean, this is the premise of domestic tragedy. Obviously, the play is a comedy and is very much a parody of that.
Mm.
But all the elements are there
Yeah,
already.
that's so interesting. That makes me think it's partly the way Iago plays on Othello, isn't it? To say what you don't realize is you're actually in a domestic tragedy. Your wife
Yes,
is having an affair with your friend,
yes,
and it's there in front of your nose and you can't
absolutely.
see
And
it.
it's a
Yeah.
domestic murder.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yes, it's such a great tip to Emma Whipday's book,
Yes.
and Emma discussed with me Measure for Measure on one of our previous webinars, and her brilliant introduction to that. So catch up with that if you haven't listened to it. If you have murdered your husband, please don't put it into the Q&A. We don't want to know. Confess it somewhere else. Um, that's such a great point to switch to some questions, Iman, because Hilary was saying, do you see parallels with the later play Merry Wives of Windsor, domestic versus public themes of indoor space, which I think is, points to some of the things that you have been
Hmm.
talking about. And then James also, hi James, good to see you. What echoes do you see with Macbeth or Othello or the Yorkshire tragedy? I suppose another of these domestic true crime plays which sort of hangs about the Shakespeare canon, but
Yeah.
not included in it by New Oxford Shakespeare, so not one of our plays.
Hmm.
Is there anything you want to add there about Yorkshire tragedy?
Yeah, I mean, a Yorkshire tragedy is interesting because of the way that it seems by 1605, when it appeared, um, there's this insatiable appetite for sensational and, if you want, particularly bloody murders. So much so that the playwright, now accepted as Thomas Middleton, um, couldn't wait for the actual trial for the murderer. So that play is again based on a true crime, of a husband and a father, the same figure, who is a spendthrift and who spends his or wastes his inheritance and ends up in this situation where he thinks, well, the charitable thing to do, because his children would be beggars, he has no money to support them or to raise them, would be to murder them. So he succeeds in killing two and he wounds his wife. But the play ends before his trial. So it ends with his wife forgiving him. She's no Alice Arden. She's passive and she's very much a stereotypical feminine figure. But we don't know what happens at trial because the play was rushed to publication and performance before that happened.
That's great to think about. I mean, that's so interesting in that true crime podcast analogy that you made, where I'm thinking about sort of Serial or something, the one that
Yes,
kicked them all off. That
yes.
these are not just reporting on, but participating in or awaiting
And
forms of
shaping,
justice.
right? And shaping and framing,
Yeah,
similar to how Arden shapes its narrative as well, um, to
yeah.
moralistic ends or political ends.
Brilliant. There's a couple of questions which I think sort of help us in two directions. One is Kibria. Thank you for your two questions. So this one says a number of themes you've discussed: land redistribution, social mobility, changing household structures, status, suggest that the play is deeply concerned with a society in transition. Yes, absolutely, really well put. To what extent do you see the murder itself as emerging from these wider social transformations rather than from individual desire or moral failure? So that's a really interesting question, which seems to me sort of countering the tragic hero model of tragedy. And then just for sort of balance, we've got Ninal's question. In what ways does ambition lead characters to destruction? So a more character-driven, perhaps,
Yes,
model of what the tragedy might be. Would
yes.
you could you talk to either of those?
Yeah, sure. Happy to talk to both because they really complement each other.
Mm.
So I think the play really demonstrates the way that both individual greed and desire and ambition, all those characters are motivated. I mean, in this play, to love someone, it's to be prepared to kill for them, literally. Um, Michael, for example, says at one point that he would kill his brother, his older brother, so he could inherit his land and be a suitable husband for Susan. Obviously, we see Alice prepared to kill her husband. So it's their greed. The hitmen, the two assassins, Blackwell and Shakebag, agreed to murder Arden literally for £10. There's money there. But also equally, as we said earlier, there's systemic as well issues here. I mean, in a way, you could argue that really the opening of the play seems to lay the blame at the feet of the king, right? Because without this reassignment of land, without taking away these lands from people who had every right to enjoy it and who built their lives around it, the tragedy, maybe Alice would have struggled a little bit more in finding fellow conspirators, but
Yeah,
those people had grudges. And Reed, for example, even though he doesn't end up being one of the murderers, he says that he's going off to sea to try and make a living, right? As a sailor, and he says that in the midst of a storm, if there's a storm happening and everyone is praying that they would be saved, please God, don't let me die, don't let me drown. I will use that time, he tells Arden, to curse you, and his curse comes to fruition. He says that let those who love you most murder you, and he wishes for his body to lie on the ground that he stole from him, and that's exactly what happens. So in a way, it's his curse that is
mm,
fulfilled at the end. So I think it's both these forces. And Lena Cohen Orlan has a really amazing phrase to talk about this play. She talks about the way that retellings of the story, including Arden, seem to purge it of its non-domestic elements. So they very much focus it on the horrible wife, lustful wife. It's a cautionary tale in how horrible women can be. But really, the story is so much more complicated and so much more rich in its implications than that suggests.
wonderful. I'm going to just ask, I think we've got time just for two more. I'm sorry if we don't have time for yours. I wanted to pick up Shabanka's question, which is about spilt blood and
Mm,
cruentation, which is
yes.
not necessarily a word in everybody's vocabulary. So
No.
maybe you might want to explain that, thinking about the status of spilt blood as evidence and perhaps
Yes.
beyond this into domestic tragedies. Thanks, Shabanka. There's more to your question, but I'm just going to focus on that bit.
Yeah, cruentation. That was actually evidence admitted in courts of law in early modern England. That's where the corpse of a murdered person would bleed afresh in the presence of their murderer. So it was taken as proof that the murderer is. So once they touch the corpse, it bleeds again, and that's it. That's evidence, and that's what happens in the play. Spilt blood is really interesting as well for the way it connects with the perversion of religious imagery that we talked about earlier. So, in the scene when the mayor and the community come in to search for his body, for Arden's body, they notice blood on the floor, and Alice immediately explains it away as wine. It's wine that Michael shed, she says.
Mm,
And those of us who are familiar with the Christian ritual of if you're in Catholic ritual, for example, the Christ blood was supposed wine was supposed to turn into Christ's blood. If you're Protestant, it
mm.
was all supposed to be symbolic, the practice of the Eucharist I'm talking about, or communion. So she seems to again, very characteristic of the way that she plays with religious imagery and the poisoned crucifix, or all of these other love is a god. Yeah, she doesn't necessarily embrace the morality that religion, we're talking Protestant Christianity, upholds.
Wonderful. I'm just going to read out Claire's question, which we might all just think about. If we accept that true crime narratives surge in popularity at times of social disruption and anxiety, what do you make of the fact that Shakespeare never returns to this, does he, in the rest of his career? I suppose we were sort of thinking about ways he kind of does, but
I
maybe
think
not
he
as
does.
not as explicitly. Yeah, really interesting. And I'm just going to ask one more, which is from Christina. Thanks for clarifying your name. this it brings us back to authorship. If Arden of Faversham were to effectively become a recognised addition to the Shakespeare canon, would there be any major change to current theories of collective authorship in the early modern era? That's a very sort of nuanced way to put that. So thank you for the question. I don't know what Iman would say to that. I think it is. I think what I would say was we have settled, particularly for Shakespeare, I suppose, with a model of um, uh, history plays being the place where somehow collaborative authorship takes place, or perhaps that material is particularly suited to collaborative authorship. Now, you could say that there's a way of saying Arden of Faversham is a very odd history play. I mean, it comes from Holinshed,
It
the
does.
source for the history plays, as Iman said right at the beginning. Um, so moving collaboration though across the genres might be interesting. But I
Yeah.
suppose, yeah, in some ways, the larger question almost is whether Shakespeare can be allowed to gobble up all the good things. That's one element perhaps of this, or if a play is good and interesting, and one of the things Iman's brilliant conversation this evening, I think, has pointed out is the wealth of scholarship that, particularly over the last sort of 25 or 30 years, has really found ways to appreciate and sort of burnish the interest of these plays. As soon as they've become interesting, it's as if, there's blood in the water and
Yes.
the ship sharks are coming
Yes.
around,
Yes.
which we might not want to
Absolutely.
allow.
I think we're still learning about collaborative authorship. And in many ways, we're still wedded to this model of authorship where, especially our Shakespeare, we want him to be this genius responsible for these wonderful plays on his own with no contamination, if you want, from anyone. But obviously, he was a man of the theatre. He was very much involved in the acting, in the running, in the everyday world of the theater. And there's no way even if he wanted, that he could have avoided being aware of what others were doing and maybe
Mm,
even tipping his toes a little bit here and there.
mm, mm. Yes, that gives me just a moment to reply to Jacob, thanks, who wants to make a Shakespeare shelf for himself after his exams and is wondering whether it should be the new Oxford Shakespeare on them. So we're talking, Jacob, about these kinds of,
Shall I
you might
show
be able
you
to
my
see that.
my
Um,
shelf?
yeah, brilliant. Okay, so we're talking about these books here, published
And
by
look at the
OUP.
cover as well. If this
Great
doesn't,
covers. We think they're brilliant, and we think they're brilliant because they have these readable modern introductions and not too heavy annotation. Now, that depends what you're looking for, because if you want super heavy annotation and more notes on the page than text, there are
yeah,
other
they're pretty
there are other
slim. Yeah.
editions that will do that. So that's why we are very proud. I'm particularly very proud to be general editor for these, and I'm pleased that Iman uh, um, has brought Arden of Faversham into its uh, sort of first, in a way, mass market paperback edition
I
for
was
some
so
time.
honored
Yeah,
to write this
wonderful.
introduction. Thank you.
Absolutely wonderful. Well, speaking of how wedded we are to our author figure, our next webinar is on Winter's Tale with Harry Newman. So do join us for that, and do catch up with the others if you haven't been able to do so before. Um, Iman Sheeha, thank you so much. You did a
Thank you for
wonderful job
having me.
editing with your introduction to Arden of Faversham, and I'm delighted that we've had a chance to talk about it. Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye bye. Bye.
Bye.